All right, we are going to go ahead and get started on the next session, guys. So you can make your way in. We talked about that there's going to be 3 questions, and I kind of turned the tables a little bit on the committee because I'm going to actually cover the 3rd question first, because that one has always been the most challenging one for me. And so I wanted to start there, and that's that question of control. And the question of control it's a difficult one for me. I don't know about you, but I like to be the one, I think it's a mom thing maybe. I like to be in control. I like to know I'm running the agenda, and especially the timing of everything, right? Are we not the expert timing people? So when it came to this question of control in my faith, it sort of was a challenge for me. I love a good schedule. And if you're anything like me, a good chunk of your day is consumed figuring out the agenda, the schedule, the when of life, right? What time is the meeting? When do I take my meds? How often do I water these plants? Is it too soon to buy the airline tickets, or did I miss the online sale? We're not even talking about how Uber Eats and Walmart Plus and Amazon Prime have warped our sense of timing. We do not like to wait, and we like to be in control of the timing. So, although I think this lesson applies to all of us, I want to first address the younger women that are here this morning. Though I'm older, I see you. I've been you. You're waiting on an answer from God about a pregnancy or an adoption or a marriage partner or maybe a job offer. And you're thinking, when? Why not now? Today seems like the perfect time. I've been where you are, suggesting and hoping that God will answer your well-intentioned request. And at first you're agreeable to wait as long as it takes, but then gradually, eventually starting to lose hope. God's plan often blurs in that waiting period. And we want to grab the pen back while he's still writing the story. But we're not the only ones. Sarah tried to take control of the story when she wanted to use Hagar, and did, to start her husband's lineage. And then when the Israelites were tired of waiting, they convinced Aaron to make that golden calf to worship. So these timing issues that we face and the questions that come with them so often come during our detours. And one of the detours that we've talked about that the book is based on is Jesus' detour into the desert, right? And so in Matthew chapter 4, verse 8 and 9, it says, "The devil took him, Jesus, to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you," he said, "if you will bow down and worship me." So one of the temptations there that Jesus grappled with in the desert is this question of control. Is God's plan enough? And, we hear that same thing. We confront it in our own lives. We wonder if our life's trajectory and plan and schedule should be up to us. Because especially the times when God has us on what feels like a dead-end detour. Jesus was poised to begin his history-changing public ministry, and he knew he had to fit it into an abbreviated life. So I'm sure he was chomping at the bit to get out there and get some things done. And yet God chose that time to send him into the desert for 40 days. And I'm sure God's timing had to feel a little questionable then. And for us, one of the biggest sticking points in trusting God's plan and control is his timing, right? Like many smaller towns during the pandemic, the small town where I was raised and where my parents still lived ran short of toilet paper. Like even here we did, right? And I remember talking to Mom on the phone about it. She was complaining and worrying and figuring out how to make do with facial tissues and paper towels and some other stuff. And it was just this mini crisis that fell on Mom because Dad didn't do any of the shopping. But then as the summer dragged on and Dad's cancer progressed, they had much more pressing issues on their agenda. Namely, to figure out how to see their faraway children and grandchildren as the sand slipped out of the hourglass for my dad. You see, all my life, as much as I've adored him, I've had this narrative in my head about my dad always being late. Whether it was for my basketball games or choir concerts or everyday things like dinner and church. And I was hoping that his earthly exit would prove to be a little bit late too. But I also knew that the timing of that probably wasn't going to be up to either one of us. Maybe to counterbalance my dad, I have had a mission in life to be on time. I think I was too early today. I was not going to be late. And so when God seems late, sometimes I have a hard time forgiving it. And yet he does seem off in his timing so often. He sort of has a history of it. There was 4 centuries of silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And that must have been excruciating to live through and maintain some semblance of trust in God's good timing. Israel was told by God through Malachi to wait for a messenger. And then 400 years of silence passed where no messenger spoke. That's 14 generations where the prophets were silent and there was no Savior on the scene. And then Lazarus, that's another instance of where God's timing seemed weird in the lives of believers, right? At first it seemed that God was too late for Lazarus. And then the blind man who spent his whole life blind before finally being healed. And then Abraham and Sarah, who lived so much of their lives without the promised child. And Joseph spending the best years of his life in slavery and in prison. And then every one of Job's worst nightmares were all crammed into one single day. Well, lately, God's timing has seemed a little bit poor for my life, too. At the time of my first post-recovery decline, my first bad news after I got my good news, I had just found out that my first grandchild was on the way, and I had just signed a book contract. His care seemed fleeting or poorly timed at best. But just as our God has a collection of timings we don't understand, he also has a list of ones where his timing seems spot on. For Daniel, as he faced the open-mouthed lions. For baby Moses floating on the Nile just as Pharaoh's daughter was bathing. For the bleeding woman being in a position to touch Jesus' hem at precisely the time that he walked by. And when the Red Sea split open, just as the Israelites needed to walk through. And for Abraham, receiving a sacrifice to replace Isaac, it seems God does some of his best work in the 11th hour. And we can't forget about Queen Esther, born precisely for the time that she was. We take comfort, too, in knowing that our prayers don't go out of date with God. You know, that 400-year lag between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Jesus literally entered the temple in Luke chapter 2 in precisely the way that it was prophesied in Malachi chapter 3. And with that time lag in there, it gave the prophecy and Scripture as a whole credibility. And we know from the story of Elizabeth and Zechariah and the life of Hannah and the one of Ruth, God answers even stale prayers that we may have even forgotten we prayed. Thankfully, there's no use-by date with God, and he doesn't hold us to one either. You know, though I often find God's timing suspect, I do know one thing about this lightning and light year producing God. He's not slow. He can create the world in a week when I can't seem to get the dishwasher unloaded. So maybe there's another time or another reason that he doesn't seem to act in my time. You see, God is not consumed or controlled by time as we are. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 17, it says, "And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together." So God is not in time. Time is in God. So it makes sense then that God time would be different than our time. And I want to read to you in chapter 3 of 2 Peter. I love how the Message puts this. Don't overlook the obvious here, friends. With God, one day is as good as 1,000 years as a day. God isn't late with his promise as some measure lateness. He's restraining himself on account of you, holding back the end because he doesn't want anyone lost. He's giving everyone space and time to change. It's so beautiful. This idea of time that we fight so hard to control and manipulate for our own small life is ultimately a tool used by God to save mankind. In fact, since day one, that's always been his highest priority. And as much as I'd like to hold God to my clock and my calendar, I can't. He structured time as a gift to man, not as a restraint on himself. You know, the very fact that we have individual days is a generous blessing. God could have made our lives as just one huge long day where we just get older and tireder and more depressed as we go. But in his wisdom, he made 24-hour segments with nights built in so that we could recharge and renew. He gave us the blessing of slowing life down to gain a new perspective and another chance, just like grace. When God's timing seems off in our individual lives, we can rest in this. The Spirit has told us in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 that God has woven into the world a time for every matter, and according to his wise purposes, he makes everything beautiful in its time, the time that he purposefully chooses for it. Another reason that we can trust God's timing is that he knows tomorrow. He exists above time. He's the God who sees not just me, as Hagar discovered in her desert detour, but he sees all of time and eternity. He knows tomorrow. My older brother and my dad constructed a complete in-scale model railroad village in our basement when I was growing up. It was an entire city that was built on a plywood platform that was about the size of a banquet table. And they used such precision, and it was such an important project and so serious. And it was down there all the years I was growing up in the basement. And of course, it was off limits to clumsy little sister hands. But I would crawl in a chair next to it, and I would look out over that village on that platform. And I was always amazed that I could see everything on that platform. I could see the little families that they'd put that were waving and the working street lights. I could see the trees. I could see it all. And even more than that, once they started the train and turned it on, I could see where the train was going to end up. And I could see the obstacles on the track before the train got there. I could see that pencil that my brother accidentally left on the track, or I could see that abandoned car over by the general store, and the train had no idea The people on the train didn't know. The conductor on the train didn't know. But I could see it because I took it all in at once. And I think that's how God sees our lives, taking all of it in at once. He knows what we're going to be facing. He knows all of the decisions and the consequences and the natural disasters we'll face and the disappointments and the heartbreaks and the celebration. He knows. And it's a comforting picture, isn't it? That the creator and sustainer of the world can see it all already before it happens. You know, God's always known about every uncertain minute of my 8 years with heart failure. It didn't matter that sometimes I doubted his care, I doubted his involvement, I doubted his power. He was still in control. He knew what was happening, and he was watching, and he never stopped caring for me. He held my whole lifetime in his hands, even though I could only see the beginning of it. Another reason we can trust God's good timing is that he's always gone ahead of us. Even better than just knowing about the future and being able to see it like I could in the basement on that train set, he already exists in the future. Wherever we're headed, God's already there. Cancer, divorce, bankruptcy, depression, heart failure. He's ahead of every one of us, building a track and turning on the lights. You know, it's like the daytime pillar of cloud and the nighttime pillar of fire that guided the Israelites through their desert. In order for God to lead them that way, he had to be out in front of them. He had to be in front of what was currently happening. So through 4 decades, God was way out ahead of the Israelites. He was already in the promised land. God was ahead of Jesus' Gethsemane agony at the empty tomb. He was already ahead of Mary's hometown shame in Bethlehem's manger. God was ahead of Joseph's slavery sale because he was already in the king's castle. And he was ahead of Naomi's grief because he was already with Ruth's new son. You see, God works above and apart from our human linear timeline. He sees it all, and he's in every detail, especially the future, because someone who loves us enough to die for us is way out ahead. Also, I have to tell you that long after my brother grew up and that final work session ended on that train set in our basement, plastic permanently covered it, and we finally got rid of it. But there was something else during that time that came into our basement. My aunt delivered cardboard flats of silk corsages and bouquets for my wedding. Now, don't judge about the silk flowers. It was the 80s, and it was the thing. But I remember being so appreciative of that, but even more so weeks later, my mother catered my wedding reception. That's right, the mother of the bride. And she made everything from scratch, even the bread. And I've been a mother of the bride, and I can just tell you I can't imagine that now. But I had planned as a bride the ceremony, and I was all about the ceremony, but the reception was all my mother. And I remember going from the church to the reception hall, carrying my aqua blue rose bouquet, and stepping into that reception hall after the photos, knowing that everything had been taken care of, even though I had not set foot in the hall to prepare it. My mother, who loved me beyond reason, had already been there somehow. This God who lives in our todays and tomorrows is governed by love too. So we can embrace an uncertain, God-controlled, weirdly timed future. Because like my brother designing that model train set, or a loving mother catering her daughter's wedding reception, God sees where we're headed, and he's already there. You know, I visited my 2-year-old granddaughter last week, and I was reminded of a saying, and we've all heard this. before, that everyone's fighting a silent battle that we know nothing about, except toddler parents. That one's loud, and we all know about that one, right? And those fits that we deal with are always about timing, right? They hit very differently if we're in line at Walmart and it's crowded and we're tired, or if they hit in our own home and we're alone and we're rested and we're coherent. Timing in this life matters. As someone who's really ruled by her agenda planner still, it's easy to get hung up on God's timing. But whether you're waiting for a prodigal or a pregnancy or a decision or maybe a diagnosis, or maybe you're waiting for a healing or a homecoming, we often think we can schedule in the best possible time, the most logical time. And when it doesn't happen on our schedule, we wonder why God isn't on board. But once we grasp that a loving God holds all of time, and he can juggle every detail, every decision, all at once, it's so much easier to release the timing of it all to him. In Acts chapter 1, verse 7 of the Message, it says, you don't get to know the time. Timing is the Father's business. What you'll get is the Holy Spirit. Now, speaking of timing, it's game time. So, what I need, and just in full disclosure, you guys didn't know it, but you're in teams, okay? And what I need is 3 people from each team that are 3 people that are going to walk up here, flick a ping pong ball, and walk off. That's all there is to it, but I need 3 and 3. Who's up for it? All right. So you guys on this team, I'm going to call you team 1 because I'm looking at you this way. Your job is to know who your people are and count if they flick the ball off. Count how many times. You're either going to get 1 point, 2 points, 3 points, or 0. And you guys are going to count for team 2. So team 1, come up. Yeah, 3 people. It's easy, you guys. It's easy. Okay, now, team 2, get your people ready. You're going to want to come on this side. If you're right-handed, it'll be easier on this side. Okay, so can y'all see this? I don't know if you can. Okay. So this is all you have to do. And there's 2 rules. Your arm has to be straight, so your elbow has to be locked. No bending like this, or you disqualified. And then you have to use your middle finger to flick that ball off that vase. Okay? So you have to keep walking. You can't stop. I guess there's 3 rules. Okay, so. Oops, I missed it. But this is actually how you do it. That's how you do it, right there. All right, so we just want to count how many team 1. So are you first 3 team 1? Okay, that'll be easy. Okay, and just keep walking, and you guys clap for them so they know they have to keep going. I gotcha. Don't stop though. You have to keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep. Go back. No stopping, guys. No stopping. Go, 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 go. Nope. That's a do-over. One more. All right. Last chance for team 2. Woo, woo, woo. Oh. Okay. All right. So what were the scores? 1 and 2. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. You guys are released. You're off the hook. I'm going to draw a name, and I'm going to draw until I get somebody from team 1, because they're winners. Okay. Sherilou? Oh, you're on the wrong team. Sorry. We'll get you next time. Madeline? Oh, yay, you're a winner. All right. She's got it. So she's winning a little bag of goodies. And then you get to pick one of these. This is the newest one, and this is the older one. You want the new one? And then this is yours. Okay, yay. All right. Y'all, timing is important. And although that's kind of about perspective and timing, it's a big deal. Let's see where we're at here. Want to talk a little bit, because you guys are going to talk about it in your discussion, about delays. Because we know when there's timing issues, we find ourselves waiting and we find this delay. And there's something called liminal space that we find ourselves in when we're waiting. I'm going to read from my book, just a couple of sentences here, to explain about what liminal space is if you're not familiar with that term. Liminal space is the space between losing a job and finding a new one. It's the space between leaving a home and settling into another home. It's the space between ending a relationship and starting another, or between being diagnosed and being healed. This liminal space is a place where God shuts one door and before he opens another. It's a place of transition. It's a place of not knowing. It's where faith lives. So when we're in this liminal space, we have to know how to navigate it. And I've been in liminal space, and I know that you have too. When I was first diagnosed, the nurses, I went through a lot of nurses that first 2 weeks in ICU, a lot of shift changes, and I noticed that all the nurses were coming in, they'd either come in crying or they would leave my room crying. And I didn't feel that bad, to be honest with you guys. I wasn't bleeding anywhere, I wasn't in any pain. I was playing bananagrams and I was watching movies with my kids. And I didn't realize at that time that what they were grieving was something I didn't even know to grieve at the time, is that they knew that heart failure is sort of this lifelong liminal space. It's kind of gray space. It's an inexact diagnosis. It doesn't have a specific prognosis and a charted outcome. So we end up with this sort of time, right, where nothing's going on. And you've experienced that too, and I hope that you'll be able to share that in your groups. But the good news is there is purpose in these delays. And when we're in liminal space, one of the purposes is protection. God doesn't want us to get too far ahead of him. You know, when we talked about the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, they didn't just lead God's people. They showed a protective boundary to the people. People always knew how far ahead they could go, because too far would be outside of that visible marking. Too far would be to get past God's protection and his place of leading. So sometimes delays in our life happen because otherwise, without those delays, we'd be outrunning or outpacing God. Another reason that we might have a delay is to allow us time to focus on heaven. You know, I've often complained that heart failure sort of stole time from me twice, a shortened lifespan, but then my days are very short because I require so much more rest. And I'm like, oh, I've got so much I want to get done, and now my days are short. And we had a discussion at church lately about what we're looking forward to most in heaven. And right away, I knew what it was. I was going to be released from this concept of time. I long for heaven where time can't hurt any of us anymore. You know, everything that really hurts me, it seems, is a product of time. Kids growing up, my parents growing old, fear, regret, anxiety, chronic illness. They're all products of time. And they're all powerless to hurt us outside the concept of time. So I've learned to trust the delays as space to long for that time when we're all released from time's grip on us. Those delays also help us define our devotion. When we're waiting on God's timing, we have this unique opportunity. We get to slow down instead of rushing headlong through it. We're slowing down and we define our devotion. You know, it's like Jesus' followers did on that liminal Saturday after the crucifixion, before the resurrection. Were they going to stick around or were they going to make a break for it? They had some time to think about it. And we get that too. And with Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, they both affirmed their faith when Jesus finally did arrive. But if you notice, it's before Lazarus was raised from the dead. They were still in that yucky gray space, and yet they were able to focus on God because they had that time to think. We get that same gift in liminal space as much as we don't like it. We learn that waiting on God is an essential aspect of our relationship with Him. And finally, we learn true worship. And this one is my favorite one because in liminal space, we learn if we're worshiping in the middle, when we are still confused and we don't understand and we don't have an answer to prayer yet, we know then that we're worshiping God and we're not worshiping the result or what He can give us. We're truly worshiping Him. So whether it's an actual highway or in real life, timing is part of the detour that makes it so very difficult. You know, my dad's time on earth ran out in the summer of 2020. Actually a bit earlier than we were expecting. My mom lived another 3.5 months before she suddenly passed away. But in those weeks between, Mom was heartbroken and lonely. You remember their toilet paper dilemma? Well, one day, a large box arrived at my mom's small town doorstep. And inside that box were dozens and dozens of individually wrapped rolls of toilet paper that my dad had somehow managed to locate online and order from China months and months before. And even though that was a tardy seeming delivery, that act of love sustained my mother until she was able to join her husband in eternity. So, like my dad with that surprise delivery, our Father is always working behind the scenes, and He's motivated by deep love. And even more than the dad He gave me, God's timing, which at first might seem tardy or ill-planned, can prove to be perfect in time. Okay, I am going to draw someone for another prize, and then you guys are going to go into your discussion groups. I forgot to mention that if you want to catch me in between, I'm happy to sign your book if you'd like for me to, and we're going to try to get that song going. But let me draw for a copy of the, it doesn't matter what team on this one, so. Janice Thompson? Yay! Thank you. You're welcome. All right, I think we are ready to do our discussion question.